Hello and welcome to our podcast. I'm Andrew Rakenstein. We're here with Luciana Speck and Dev Mahanti.
Hi.
Hello.
Today we will be discussing the American invasion of Canada during the War of 1812. In June of 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. The English were creating Native American unrest. Their navy was taking American merchant ships, then forcing them to serve Britain, and they set up blockades to stop America from trading with France. Once the War of 1812 began, Warhawks in Congress pushed for an invasion of Canada. There were even a few congressmen who wanted part or all of Canada to be annexed, even though it was a British colony. In 1812, President James Madison approved a three-pronged attack against Canada. Many Americans believed the invasion would be simple because Britain was distracted by the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Furthermore, the British controlled the Great Lakes, which made it easier for them to move troops and supplies, putting American troops at an even greater disadvantage.
I think the British control of the lakes played a crucial role in the operations both sides engaged in. The lack of an American navy in these waters meant that they had to move all supplies by land, which was much more hazardous than maritime transport. I believe this factor played a decisive role in the British victories during the early stages of the war. Your thoughts, Ms. Speck?
I agree. However, I believe much of the Americans' failure lies not in the maritime strength differences between the two nations, but the famous American ignorance. Not only were the Americans at a disadvantage because of the British's superior military strength, but they also put themselves in a tough position by underestimating their opponents, especially considering their attack strategies placed them on Canadian territory, which was a relatively unfamiliar terrain for the undertrained men that made up the vast majority of the American troops. U.S. General William Hull assembled a force of around 2,000 men and led them to Detroit, the point for an intended assault on nearby Fort Malden in Upper Canada. The British ended up finding out about his plans, and about 200 Ohio militiamen refused to go beyond American territory anyway. On July 12, 1812, he took his men into Canada. Hull quickly laid siege to Fort Malden, but soon withdrew after Native Americans intercepted his supply train. British commander Isaac Brock then chased the Americans back across the river and opened cannon fire at Fort Detroit from the Canadian side. Hull ended up surrendering the entire army and the city that August after a cannonball smashed into his officers' mess, killing 4. At the same time in the east, U.S. General Stephen von Rensselaer prepared an assault on Queenston Heights. During the invasion, Americans briefly took the high ground by marching up an unguarded fisherman's path. But 950 U.S. troops were driven down from the heights by the Canadian forces and captured after a group of New York militiamen refused to leave American territory and come to their aid.
An interesting facet of both of these battles is the refusal of American troops to cross the border into Canada. This highlights the decentralized structure existing in the American Army at the time. Stemming from their experience under British rule, where a professional army existed, the American government favored a small army of trained soldiers, which would be supplemented in wartime by citizens who would form militias. These militias would serve locally to fend off invaders on the borders and invade enemy territory on the frontiers. While it sounded well in theory, many militiamen were not under the command of the army and thus were not obligated to follow orders by generals. Militias which didn't want to leave their local area, therefore, were entirely within their rights to remain where they were.
Militiamen not helping the troops and failure of the American troops when outnumbering Canadian and British forces was a recurring theme throughout the war. This especially was true with General Hull and his troops. While invading, Hull took the fort even with the British knowing his plans, but militiamen failed to help them keep control. Then Hull retreated back to Fort Detroit with most of his troops and couldn't set up a viable defense in his own fort. He ended up surrendering a major fort and all of his troops just because a cannon fired in and killed 4 officers. He was truly scared of the opposition, and as a general in war, that isn't a part of the winning solution.
Now, in the third prong of the attack, U.S. General Henry Dearborn marched his 6,000 troops from Albany to Plattsburgh, New York. Their part in the plan was to capture Montreal, but once again, state militiamen refused to leave the United States. Unfortunately, Americans accidentally fired on each other in the dark, which in turn caused the force to retreat without ever even entering Canada. The United States pulled its act together in 1813 with the help of an improved navy, a larger army, new military commanders such as future President William Henry Harrison, and more experienced troops. Over the span of just a few months, American troops destroyed the British fleet on Lake Erie, took over the strategically important Fort George near the mouth of the Niagara River, and reclaimed Detroit on their way toward winning the Battle of the Thames. The Americans also captured York, the city currently known as Toronto. A failed campaign against Montreal turned the tide back to the British, with the Americans being pushed back across the Niagara River. More fighting took place along this river in 1814, but by that time the Napoleonic Wars were ending in Europe, and Britain was able to send thousands of experienced troops to the American front. This put America more on the defensive, making Canada virtually impossible to obtain. The last of its troops left Canada in 1814 after evacuating and blowing up Fort Erie.
The defeats at the end of the war were very important as they ended American dreams of annexing Canada. Prior to this, many thought the U.S. would encompass the entirety of British North America. Failing in their second attempt to invade Canada forced American attention west instead of north.
America didn't gain anything physical from this invasion, but it did help them in a few ways. This really told the rest of the world they are a country and they are separate from Britain and won't ever go back. America also gained respect from many European countries for defending themselves against Great Britain virtually without help. This was the beginning of a truly independent America being on the national scene. With better trained generals and recruits, America showed it's possible that they could have succeeded, and we could be living in a radically different world than we currently do. And that's all the time we have for you today. I'm Andrew Rakenstein with Dev Mahanti and Luciana Specht. Thank you for listening.